Well, good morning, everyone. You guys look great today. Even with your mask on, you guys look great. Hey, I want to start out. I don't know if it's you or just me, but I hate moving. Anybody with me on that? I hate moving, and not just really moving, but the process of moving. Are you guys with me on that? Like I don't mind moving, and I've moved quite a few times in my life, but I hate the process of moving where you're gathering as many boxes as you can, right? And you got to go to U-Haul and get those special boxes that you put the dishes in and the glasses and all that stuff, the wardrobe, and you're asking your friends, hey, do you have boxes? And I hate that whole process, but here's what I've learned in the process of moving so many times, probably 15, 20 times in my life, is there is a big difference between moving across town and moving across country. Any of you guys with me on that? So I've done both, and there's a difference, because if you're moving across town, although it's not fun and it's still hard, especially I've moved at once like 2 miles down the road, and you sort of just don't really care as much about how it's packed. Like you just want to get rid of it, and you can make a couple trips if you want, and if you can't fit everything in the truck or the car, you'll come back and get it. You just start throwing things in the car, right? Start throwing things in the truck, and you'll come back. But if you're going across the country, it's one way, one time. You've got to get everything in that truck, right? I mean, that is incredibly tough, and you're trying to figure things out. I remember a long time ago, Amy Jo and I, we were moving, our biggest move that we ever had made up to that point, from Atlanta, Georgia to Denver, Colorado. And it was just the two of us, and Carson was about 5 months old. And so we decided we were going to, because it was such a big move, we were going to hire a moving company. Now, just a warning is, it's not wise to hire the cheapest moving company, okay? Which is what we did. You want to hire someone that you trust to move your stuff, right? Because this is everything. And so they had this huge semi truck. It's the biggest moving truck I've ever seen in my life. Not because we had tons of stuff, it's because they were moving 2 other families in that same truck. In fact, there was a car from someone else in this truck. I mean, it was massive, and a big, huge semi. And so I was like, we're going to have to pack this really, really well. We weren't paying them to pack. That's a lot more expensive. That's the way to go if you have the money. But we were paying them to take everything that we had out of our house onto the truck and then travel thousands of miles to Denver, Colorado. They were going to meet us there. It took them 2 weeks to actually unload all 3 families. And so we were going to meet them out there. We're going to drive separately, meet them out. Now, a couple weeks before, I'm freaking out, and I'm getting really nervous because although we don't have a lot of stuff, the stuff that we had, this is everything that we own, everything that we have in our house is going to be on this truck, and we're trusting them not to break everything. So I'm stressing out 2 weeks before. I become super obsessive, right? About what to pack, what not to pack. And that tough time as you're moving in the process, you're like, we've got too much junk, right? Like every time you move, it's like, we got too much stuff, and you have to decide, and then you have this argument with your spouse or with your family. We need to throw this away. We haven't used this in years. And so we're doing that. Amy Jo and I are doing this. And I'm obsessive about, I don't know how they're going to move our stuff. I've seen how some people move, okay? And they might throw boxes, so I'm just overly cautious. And I get a lot of blankets, a lot of towels. I'm double wrapping things, triple wrapping things, putting pillows and sheets on everything. I'm individually wrapping and making sure that I have enough newspaper. I think I bought 1,000 newspapers because I wanted to make sure that nothing broke inside. And we're at the end. It's 2 days before we start labeling all our boxes. Everything, by the way, everything has to get in a box, right? Because they're movers and it's in a truck, and everything has to be in a box. We can't just throw things up there. And so we're labeling everything, ready for them, getting ready. And just deep inside of me, I'm like, man, I hope they don't break anything. And so I get my black marker. And after we've already labeled everything, I go through, and no lie, you can ask Amy Jo this, almost on every box, even the box that we had to wrap and put in a box, our pillows. Even in the box of pillows, I wrote the words. I was super obsessive. I think every box had these letters: F, R, A, G, I, L, Fragile, every box. I didn't care what it was, whether it was not fragile or not. I did not want to lose anything on the trip. And they come in, they're like, so everything's fragile? Yes, it is. Be careful with everything, right? And I was thinking about that move this week. And I was thinking, isn't that the word that most of us would sum up our lives right now? Fragile. Fragile. I was thinking if I could just sum up what most of us in this room are experiencing right now in life, it'd be the word fragile. Well, let's just be honest. It's a time in history where our human frailty takes center stage. I mean, everything is fragile right now. Or so it seems. Our world is fragile, right? The natural catastrophes, the oppression, the injustice, the division that happens around us, fragile. Doesn't it seem like our relationships are more fragile right now? Like one word or one disagreement, and it ends the relationship just like that. One big blow up with a family member, and that relationship begins to go sideways. Fragile. Our emotions are fragile. I mean, if we were honest with ourselves, all of us in this room, we're emotionally on edge like never before. Right? Again, one word spoken, mask, vaccine, COVID, Republican, Democrat, whatever it is, throws us out of whack. And emotionally, we're all over the place and up and down. We're fragile. Our confidence is fragile. Right? One negative comment, one negative experience that we go through in life, and it throws us off our game. Fragile. Even our faith, let's just be honest, even our faith is fragile right now. We're looking at this world, we're looking at what we're all experiencing, we're saying, God, how can you be the God of the universe and let this happen? And some of us are really reflecting on everything that religion and Christianity has to offer, and it doesn't seem to be working really well, to be honest with you, in some ways, and we look at that and say, does my faith really make sense anymore? I mean, let's just be honest, we're in such a delicate state of mind right now as humans. And no matter how many handle with care stickers that we cover ourselves up with, our frailty is beginning to take its toll on us. And we're trying to hold up the pieces. We're trying to keep all the pieces stayed together. And some days we're doing a pretty good job of it, and other days, not so much. Any of you relate to that? Any of you are experiencing that right now? We're fragile. And so here's the question I want to ask today. How do we live and grow and thrive, even find happiness and fulfillment and joy in the midst of our frailty? Or is that even possible? I mean, who are you kidding, Steve? Like that's not really possible to be so fragile and yet have life and be able to grow and have happiness. Well, that's why I'm excited about today, because today and today only, this is just a standalone, I want us to have an open and honest conversation about what we're all feeling and thinking inside. I want to have just this open conversation, this raw conversation from your pastor to you about what we're all thinking, what we're all feeling right now, how fragile we just seem to be right now. And I want to use the words of the Apostle Paul that he spoke about 2,000 years ago to a church in the city of Corinth. Now, Paul, probably more than anyone else, he understood just how fragile this world and our existence can be. For example, just listen to these words that he writes to a bunch of Jesus followers, a church very much like ours that just happened to be in the first century. Listen to what he says and how he can encourage us today in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Listen to these words. For God, who said, "Let there be light," in the darkness, has made this light shine in our hearts so we could know the glory of God that is seen in the face of Jesus Christ. We now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Through suffering, our bodies continue to share in the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. And here's what I love that Paul does here. He calls it like he sees it. He understands that this world and our lives is incredibly fragile. He just goes out and says, listen, this is life. We're just fragile clay pots living in a fragile clay pot world. That's all we are. We're just fragile clay pots living in a fragile clay pot world. Even as followers of Jesus, this is what I love about what Paul says here. He's talking to a bunch of Jesus followers. He says, just because you follow Jesus, just because you believe in Jesus, doesn't mean that you're all strong and confident all the time. No, we're fragile human beings. And Paul reminds us we're just a bunch of clay pots living in a clay pot world. Speaking of clay pots, I remember years and years ago, Amy Jo and I led a mission trip with a bunch of teens to Oaxaca, Mexico, deep into Mexico. And we spent about 2 weeks in the remote villages outside of Oaxaca City, Oaxaca, the state of Mexico. And the last day, before we were gonna drive back up to Mexico City and fly out from Mexico City to Denver, Colorado, where we were living at the time, we decided to do some sightseeing in Oaxaca City, the capital, and a very thriving metropolis. And so we went and we did all the tourist stuff that day. We did a lot of stuff. And that night we ate, and then we went to the city markets and looked for stuff and haggled with them and got some cool stuff. And Amy Jo was with a bunch of girls and they were shopping, and I was with a bunch of guys and we were shopping. And I went to this city market, and I found that this city market had all these types of clay pots. Now, what you need to understand about Oaxaca is they have this unique clay pot color. It's basically black clay that can only be found in Oaxaca. It's one of the rarest kinds of black clay in all the world, so you won't find it hardly anywhere else in the world. But Oaxaca has this black clay, and so they make this pottery out of it, and it's beautiful. I know black pottery doesn't sound that beautiful, but it was amazing. And this one shop at this market, I was like, wow, this is so cool. And I was like, I'm gonna decide to buy something for Amy Jo and surprise her. And so there was this big clay pot, this beautiful black clay pot. It's probably about 2 feet high, probably about 10, 12 inches wide. It was this big, beautiful black pot. And I'm like, I'll take it. And we haggled a little bit. I got a good price for it. I got it. We came back together. I showed Amy Jo. I said, hey, look what I got you. It's this beautiful piece of black clay pot. You can't get anywhere else in the world. And she was so excited. I scored some points that day. It was awesome, right? The problem was I hadn't thought it all the way through. This is a big pot. I don't have room for it on my trip home, right? We packed really tightly, and I had this small duffel bag for the whole 2 weeks. There is no way my pot that I just bought would be the only thing in this. And so I'm like, I can't put it in my travel kit. And I asked Amy Jo, she didn't have room. Our carry-on bags, no way. No way. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this? I started begging with others, hey, can I put this in your stuff? You can cram it in there, can't you? But then I was like, I don't want to cram it in there, right? Because it's a fragile clay pot. And I'm like, what am I going to do? And I decided I was going to hold this pot all throughout my trip back to Denver, Colorado. I was going to hold it. I was going to make sure, because it's fragile, I was going to make sure that it was not going to break. So the 6-hour trip, mind you, on a bus with rocky roads, I was sitting there in my seat on the bus holding this like it was my life, right? Because it was so fragile. And there were a couple times where it almost fell out of my hands. People were playing with it. I was like, don't touch it, right? Because it's fragile. And we get on the plane and they're like, you want to check this on to the plane? I'm like, no way. Like, I see what you do with our luggage, right? You just throw it on there. What about the overhead? No, because if it rolls around, it's so fragile. I am holding on to this. And the stewardess tried to convince me otherwise. She said, well, you're going to have to put it under your seat when we take off and land. I'm like, okay. So I'm holding on to this thing. Like I'm drinking with one hand, and eating some peanuts, and then I'm holding on to it, right? And when we take off, when we land, I'm putting it between my feet, and literally my feet are together, and I'm holding this so tight. Like if we get in an accident, if we get in a wreck, like, hey, my feet might break, but this pottery is not going to break. It's not going to be destroyed. And all the way home, I mean, there's some questionable times where I thought it was going to break, but it doesn't break. We get it home to Denver, Colorado. I'm so relieved. It was awesome. We put it on our mantle in our living room, and it was a great talking piece for years. Fast forward 10 years later, we're in Indianapolis. Some family friends come over while I'm at work, and the kids, one of the one of the good kids that they have, he was playing around with around this vase, this clay pot, and he tipped it over, and it broke and shattered into about 12 to 15 pieces. Needless to say that we banned that kid from my house. He was never, no, I'm just kidding. We didn't do that. But like the mom freaked out. And so she was like, I've got to put this back together. I know how important this is to Steve before he gets home. And she tried to glue it back together and did a miserable job. When I get home, I look at it and notice it looks like a first grader put it together, right? And it looked horrible. And she apologized over and over again. I said, yeah, just get your bratty kid out of here. I'm just kidding. I didn't say that. I gave him a lot of grace, but she felt so bad about it, and it was such a horrible job putting it back together that we had to throw it away. In this passage of scripture, Paul says, that's us. It's you. It's me. I mean, we're just a fragile clay pot living in a fragile clay pot world. We're fragile. And there's no way around it. I wish we weren't, but we are. We're just fragile people. And I love what Paul says, because Paul doesn't just say, hey, we're fragile. He actually tells us that there is this treasure within inside us, this fragile clay pot that we live in. There's this treasure within us if we can just dig deep and find it. And this treasure, it will shine light into our lives. It will bring hope. It will release power in our lives if we can just find that treasure. And the treasure, Paul says, is in Jesus Christ. Listen to how he says it. Listen again. He tells us how we can actually engage and find and receive this treasure. Look again at verse 7. He says, we now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. And this is so important for us to understand. Listen to this. This is so important that you and I get this. Even in our greatest moments in life, even on our best day, when we think we can conquer the world, like, here I come, world, I've got this. You still don't have what it takes. And neither do I. Even with all your experience and all your power and all your skill and all your ability and all the passion and commitment and drive you want, I'm telling you, it's still not enough. There is not enough power in you personally that will get you through what you're going through. But maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So let me just take a step back and breathe a little bit. Because before we talk about this great treasure, this power that comes from God, according to the Apostle Paul, I think it's important that you and I realize that you are most fragile when you are least capable. That's how we end up fragile. When we find ourselves in life least capable. It's in those moments that we are most fragile. It's when you feel a sense of losing your power. You ever get to a place in your life where you're like, I'm losing the power. I'm losing control of the situation. I'm losing my authority. That's when you are most fragile. It's when you feel like as if you have very little impact on all that's happening around you or happening to you. That's when you're most fragile. It's when you don't feel capable at all in fixing the problems that are right in front of you. That's when you and I are most fragile. And I wonder, is there anyone here that is experiencing that? I am. I mean, the last 24 months has been the perfect storm for all of us. The COVID thing, natural catastrophes, oppression, injustice, racism, division, all the politics. I mean, if we were to be honest, it's just left us feeling powerless and incapable and vulnerable and dumbfounded. I wish it wasn't true. But it is. I mean, we're the most fragile when we're the least capable. Now, that might sound like bad news to you and me. But I promise you, I'm telling you, this is awesome news. This truth, this reality that you and I, we're most fragile when we're least capable. That's actually awesome news. Paul, the apostle, as he talks about us being fragile, he said it's actually a good thing. Now, he didn't have that thought and have that truth. He actually discovered that the hard way. For example, there was this one point in his life where there was something that was hindering him from living the life that he really wanted to live. He called it a thorn in his flesh. And we really have no idea what this thorn in the flesh was. It could have literally been a thorn in his flesh, but most people think that it was symbolic of something else going on in life, maybe something relational, or it could have been physical, it could have been spiritual, it could have been emotional, but there was obviously something in Paul's life that was hindering him. And as it hindered him, here's what happened is he came face to face with his own frailty. And if you know anything about the Apostle Paul, as we know his personality in the Bible, you know this probably disturbed him, that he hated feeling fragile. So I want us to look at actually how he describes this personally and how it went down in his own life. In 2 Corinthians, this same letter that he writes to this church, listen to what he says in chapter 12. He says, so to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times, I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time, God said, my grace is all you need, Paul. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. Listen to this, and here's his conclusion. For when I am weak, then I am strong. See, your frailty is God's power. When you are at your most fragile in life, that is when God is most powerful. See, what you see today as a weakness, God sees as an opportunity. What you see today as frailty, God sees as strength. What you see today as a deficiency, God sees as sufficiency. Your frailty is God's power. When you and I are most fragile, that's when God is most powerful. We see this over and over again in the Bible. Story after story of real people, just like me, just like you, who are in a fragile moment in their lives, and God displays his power in their lives. There's Hannah. This poor woman who had prayed and prayed and prayed about having a son. All she had ever dreamed of in her life was to have a baby, and she wasn't able to have a baby. Her womb wasn't able to receive a baby. And some of you know the pain and the hurt that comes with trying to have a baby and not able to have a baby. And we find Hannah so fragile and so messed up and broken with this. She comes to God one day and she just lets it out. And all of her sadness, all of her hurt, all of her pain says, God, just give me a baby. And in that frailty, God supernaturally intervenes, reveals his power, and she has a son. There's Gideon, who at some point in his life, he was this powerful, bold-filled judge of Israel. But that's not how God discovered him. In fact, God knew about this guy named Gideon, and he wanted him to lead the charge against the enemy. But guess where he found Gideon? He found Gideon all afraid and scared, hiding in a wine press. He was anything but bold. He was anything but confident. He was fragile, and he was so scared of the enemy that he was like a little kid hiding in a barrel. And God said, I want you to lead my people against the enemies. And Gideon responds. And in his frailty, God reveals his power. There's David, who after he had committed adultery and had a man killed, God confronts him through a prophet, and David owns up to it and says, I'm so sorry, I blew it with you, God. And God says, there are going to be consequences to your sin, but here's the deal. I still want you to be the leader of my people. And David continued to be and was known as the greatest king of all of Israel. Your frailty is God's power. Embrace that today. Understand that today. Paul discovered it the hard way, but he discovered this treasure, this power of God. So let me ask you this question today, and I don't want you to answer right away. And this is a question just between you and God. What is one weakness in your life right now that is hindering you? Be honest with yourself. What is one thing in your life? And it's a weakness. And it's hindering you. It might be hindering your relationships. It might be hindering your marriage. It might be hindering your career or your finances or your emotions or even your faith. What is that weakness in your life right now? That thorn in your flesh that is really hindering you in your life? Now, I want to be honest with you here this morning. Some of you might be tempted to say, well, Steve, I can't really think of anything. So let me help you out here for a second. If you're here today and if you're being honest with yourself and you can't think of one weakness that is hindering you in your life, your weakness is probably a lack of self-awareness of who you are. All you need to do is go to someone who knows you well and ask them, and they'll tell you. What is that weakness that is hindering you? And I'm asking you that question not to discourage you, not to drag you down, but so that you face it, so that you recognize it, and then surrender it over to God through Jesus Christ. See, I think if the Apostle Paul was right here, right now with us today, here's what he would say. He would say, allow Jesus to work through, not in spite of your weakness. Like I think if Paul could transport to 21st century Journey Church, I think he would come up here and he would say, listen, I need you to allow Jesus to work through, not in spite of your weakness. Because there's a big difference between the two. You see, most of us, here's how we look at our weaknesses. We'll go to God and we'll say, God, we'll do one of two things. We'll ask God, God, take this away from me. Overcome this weakness in my life and get it out of my life. It's what Paul did. Paul 3 times begged God, God, take this away, take this away, take this away. Now, God has the power to take away just like that, but many times he doesn't, which we're going to understand here in a second. That's one approach. The other approach is coming to God and saying, God, listen, I'm horrible. Like, I'm so weak. I'm so fragile. And here's a weakness that I've been fighting for years and I still haven't overcome it. God, will you overlook that? Will you use me and work in me and move in my life in spite of that weakness? See, the problem with that, and trust me, because I've lived this in my own life, is when your approach is that with your weakness, what it leads to is guilt and shame, never feeling like you're good enough for anyone or for God. You're unworthy. So either one of those approaches will never get you to where you need to go in life. That's why I'm going to ask you this morning, take that weakness, if you're really honest, whatever God is prompting you with that weakness, and surrender it to God through Jesus Christ this morning. Don't ask him to get rid of it. Don't ask him to overlook it or forget it or ignore it. Ask him to work through it to reveal his power to you in your life and to others. Allow Jesus, surrender your weakness over to Jesus so that he can work through it. That's where Paul landed in his own life. But there's one other thing that I want you to notice, what Paul says about this fragile clay pots that we live, that's our lives. Look again at verses 8 through 10. He says, for we are pressed on every side by troubles. Anybody feel like that today? We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed. Anyone here perplexed and dumbfounded about the world right now? We are perplexed, but we are not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Through suffering, our bodies continue to share in the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. Now, here's what I love, and you can't miss it. Paul seems to insist on continually using the plural here. In fact, over and over again in this passage of scripture, he uses the two-letter word, we. We, us, our. I mean, it's almost as if Paul thinks that the best way to allow Jesus to work through our weakness is within community. It's almost as if Paul assumes that followers of Jesus Christ, those of us who are going after Jesus, we need to do it together. It's almost as if Paul assumes that we're not doing this thing called life alone. And I've said this before, but I think it's appropriate at this time of life. One of the great tragedies of life, really, and the last 24 months have only magnified this, is that we have convinced ourselves, listen, we have convinced ourselves that it is very normal and totally acceptable that when we feel most vulnerable, when we are fragile in our lives, the best thing to do is to withdraw from our relationships. We've convinced ourselves that that's normal, that's totally acceptable. That when we're not feeling it, that when we're going through some hard times, when we feel broken and lost and empty, I mean, we're vulnerable. We're so fragile. We've convinced ourselves that the default needs to be isolation. And for Paul, that's just not acceptable. He wouldn't even consider any of us going through these issues on our own. In fact, Paul just assumes, hey, I know that's probably where our gut tells us that when life isn't great, when I feel fragile and vulnerable, I'm just going to withdraw from relationships. I'm just going to be around myself. Paul says, no. You have to fight through that mentality. We're in this together. Someone once said, when you are fragile alone, you are fragile still. Which means that you and I will never be able to fully experience the treasure that he talks about, this treasure of Jesus Christ that shines light, that gives us hope, that releases power in our lives without each other. And I'm telling you, you'll never experience it if you are a lone ranger. I think that's why Paul encourages another church about the same time that he wrote the church at Corinth. He writes to this church in Galatians. This is what he says in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. He says, share each other's burdens, and in this way obey the law of Christ. We're in this together. Share each other's burdens. And when Paul says share each other's burdens, what he's not saying is, hey, just ask for prayer requests. You know what, I'm struggling with this. Will you pray for me? And that's not a bad thing. But when Paul is using this phrase, share with each other your burdens, what he's talking about is as you share life with one another, share the burdens, be open, be authentic, that life isn't always grand, life isn't always good, life isn't always, I'm not always feeling it. So be open about that and share with each other. As you're sharing life together, share your burdens together. And can I tell you something? Christians, we've done a miserable job of this, myself included. We've done a horrible job. We've missed the mark with that. Share each other's burdens. That means we have to be open and authentic with one another. And what I've discovered when I have those glimpses in my own life is something amazing happens when you're open and authentic and vulnerable to others and say, this is how I feel right now. I'm losing it. I'm trying to hold the pieces together the best I can, but I can't. Something amazing happens because as you tell this and you share your burdens, guess what? Other people will say, you know what? Me too. I know how you feel because that's how I feel. Oh, you're questioning that right now? Those are some doubts that you have right now? Me too. You're struggling with this whole COVID thing and you're scared and afraid. Me too. See, in a surprising twist, when you are openly sharing your burdens with other people and being real, being authentic, the surprising twist is it actually becomes a source of strength for them and for you. Weird, I know, but it's true. So here's where we need to be. Here's the place we need to get to in life is we allow our frailty to be an encouragement for others. That's really where you want to be in life is to share each other's burdens so that I can be a source of strength for you and you can be a source of strength for me, that we can share in each other's struggles and in a weird way that actually encourages us, that strengthens us. Allow your frailty to be an encouragement to others. That's what you need to do. Now, that's easier said than done. And that's going to take a lot of hard work for all of us. But the one thing it's going to take more than anything else is for your willingness and my willingness to invest the time and the relational energy into this, our church, our faith community. To be serious about, not just coming here on a Sunday and sitting in a seat. And that's great. I'm glad you're here. But you're missing so much more if you're not investing your time and relational energy into the people who come here, who are part of this community, who are part of saying we're trying to follow after Jesus in a crazy world. I've said this before. I've said this from day one, 9-10 years ago. As pastor of Journey Church, my commitment to you is that, and my continued promise to you is that Journey Church will always be a place where it's okay not to be okay. It will always be that place. We don't have to pretend to have it all together. We don't have to pretend that everything's okay because the truth is everything isn't always okay. And that's okay. So we have to change our mindset because as followers of Jesus, we haven't always done a good job of this because we fear that people would judge us. And I want you to know here at Journey Church, we're just not going to judge each other. We're going to recognize that we're fragile, broken people. We're just a bunch of fragile clay pots living in a fragile clay pot world. We need to accept that. We need to accept each other as we are and go after Jesus together. Will you commit with me to dive deeper into the relationships that God has given us here? There are hundreds of people that call Journey Church home. And we want to invest in those relationships so we can share our burdens. And so one of the practical ways that we're intentional about it here in Journey Church. And I want to invite you to next Sunday, right after second service, is a meet journey. And we want as many people to come as possible to this. We're going to feed you lunch, and you get to meet other people at Journey, because it's not just about coming here on a Sunday and sitting in a seat, experiencing a worship experience and being encouraged and leave. And so we want to encourage you to come next Sunday after second service, meet Journey. Let us know you're coming, because we want to have enough food. All you need to do is text the words meet Journey. You can get out your phone now and do it. Text the word meet Journey to 630-491-4090, or let us know, let someone in leadership know. That's a great first step to get to know some other people beyond just a superficial hi on a Sunday morning. Now, to end today, I want to take all of what Paul has said here. And as we take it to heart, I hope and pray that we can hear these words over the next few moments. Because Paul does encourage us, there is a way to thrive in the midst of our frailty. It's possible. So let me leave you with 3 things to do and to commit to in your own life that will allow you, even as you are fragile right now in life, you can thrive and grow and find happiness and joy. The first one is this: lead out with authenticity. Just be the one that says, you know what? I'm not going to pretend. When everything's not okay, I'm going to make people aware of it. I'm never going to act as if I have it all figured out. I love through all the things and the issues that we dealt with as a culture, when one of my friends or someone I know, maybe on Facebook, when they say I have it all figured out, they think they know everything about everything. Like, we have friends like that. Like, I don't even listen to them, because none of us have this all figured out. So just own up to that. Embrace it. And then share that authenticity with others. Lead out with authenticity. The only thing that you can do is control you. And you can be real. You can be authentic. And here's the cool thing. Authenticity breeds authenticity. When you are real with people, people will be real with you. They will feel like this is a safe place. Lead out with authenticity. If you're hurting, say you're hurting. If you have serious questions, ask some tough questions. If you are totally lost and empty, get some help. Lead out with authenticity. I'm telling you, the more authentic you can be, the more you'll learn to thrive. The second thing is this, is live with courage. Live with courage. Know that the power you need is the power God offers you. I mean, we serve a powerful God, don't we? We serve a powerful God. Live like it. Go to work tomorrow like it. Well, not tomorrow. Most of us are off. Go to Tuesday. Go to work like you serve a powerful God. Take steps of faith in your life like God is the powerful God that he says he is. Man, we need to live with courage. I run into people so much lately that have lost the courage. They're playing it safe in life. They're not risking. They're not taking steps of faith because everything in life is so fragile. And when everything in life is so fragile, we like to play it safe, and we have no confidence in anything right now. But I can tell you what we should have confidence in. That's our Almighty God. Live with courage. Be bold, because the Bible says the power in you through Jesus Christ is greater than the power in the world. Live with courage. Be bold. And then finally, lean into grace. Lean into grace like you've never leaned into grace before. First off, lean into the grace of God through Jesus Christ. Every day, lean into his grace. Every day, the more incapable you feel in life, go back to the cross and lean into God's grace more and more and more. And as you lean more and more into God's grace, you recognize, hey, I need to give some other people grace. Man, that's missing so much in our world right now. And here's what I've discovered. After I say it, you're probably like, yeah, you're right. Here's what I've discovered about us, especially in our culture today, is the more fragile we have become, the stingier we are with grace. Right? Isn't that true? Like the more fragile we are, the more vulnerable we feel, the stingier we have become with grace. And this world needs grace now more than ever. There is a shortage of grace in our culture, and it's killing us. You can call it cancel culture. You can call it judgmentalism. You can call it, ghosting, whatever it is. This world is in desperate need of grace. I need grace now more than ever. As your pastor, as just a human being, I need your grace. We need each other's grace. Lean into it. The church of Jesus, the followers of Jesus, we should lead the way in grace. And if we're ever going to err, let's err on the side of grace. Give people some grace today, okay? No one has this figured out. We're all going through this together. Let's be Jesus to the world around us. One of my favorite scriptures in the Bible, John chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. John opens up this book about the greatest man who's ever lived, Jesus, and he says these words. He says, now out of his fullness, meaning Jesus, because of how he lived and died and resurrected, this is his life. Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. In other translations, it says grace upon grace. And because of this grace upon grace, for the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. I love that. We've received grace upon grace, upon grace, upon grace. Tomorrow, you're going to experience grace that's going to take the place of the grace today. There is always grace for all of us through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. May that move in us. May that change us. But as a result of that, may we recognize that everyone needs grace. And we're the leaders. We lead out in this world with grace. In a moment, we're going to pray. And during this prayer, my prayer is that God will speak to you, that God's Spirit will speak to your spirit. And there's a prompting. Call it a voice, call it whatever, but there's a prompting from God's Spirit to you right now, if you're open to it, about what this looks like in your life and the weakness that maybe has been hindering your life. And it's time to surrender that and to recognize I'm fragile right now. And maybe for some of you, this is an aha moment. This is what I've been feeling for the last couple years. And that's a good thing, because that's when God takes a hold and does something remarkable. So I'm going to pray, but I hope you will join me in this prayer today on your own as you listen to God speak to you. Let's pray. God, we come to you today. And our hope is that we're honest with you. No one else needs to know, but we want to be honest with you right now. There are things in all of our lives that are really holding us back. They're hindering us. They might be hindering our relationships, our faith, our marriage, our family. But God, we know in that weakness, because we are fragile human beings, we know in that weakness is where you do your work. You shine the light. You give hope. You release power. So God, whatever that weakness is in our lives, God, right now, I'm asking that you give each of us the boldness and the confidence to just surrender that to you right now, right here. God, I also ask that if there are those of us who we don't feel right with you, and maybe it's because of guilt or shame or what we did last week or what we did 5 years ago, that we would lean into your grace like never before, that we would rely on your grace like never before, and that we leave here today that we would feel the freedom that comes from grace through Jesus Christ, that today that we would accept Jesus and accept the grace that's offered to us, that we would leave here released of our guilt, released of our shame. And as we come out of here feeling free because of our newfound relationship with your son, Jesus, that we would show that our lives would reveal that in every interaction we have. God, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for everything he's done for us. We thank you for the light he shines, the hope he gives, and the power he releases. God, we thank you for these words of Paul that are desperately needed, I know for me, in a time like this, in a season like we're going through. May we use it to strengthen us. And it's in Jesus' name we pray this. Amen.